afternoon. Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. We have with us a very rare three-peat guest, one of the most beloved guests we have on the show, Arthur Herman, who is a historian. I'm going to go through your bibliography because it is so diverse, and by which I don't mean there's one book about black people. I mean just all over the map intellectually, and just so much great material there. Let's go through it.
Okay.
I'm going to do a little bit out of order. Joseph McCarthy, biography of McCarthy. How the Scots Invented the Modern World. That is a book which people cite a lot.
It's a New York Times bestseller.
Yeah, but it's also, I think, a big kind of trendsetter in terms of how people view discourse.
And people have said, if you have to go do a speech to any kind of Scottish organization, get that book because you'll have anecdotes and stories in there that no one has heard before.
How the British Navy shaped the modern world to rule the waves. I'm getting a whale tooth pen made for me right now, which is illegal. Gandhi and Churchill. Freedom's Forge, how America's business produced victory in World War II. This one I love, The Cave and the Light, Plato versus Aristotle. Douglas MacArthur. And most recently, 1917, Lenin Wilson and the Birth of a New World Disorder. I thought it was The New World Disorder.
Yeah, it should be the New World.
It is the. On your Wikipedia, it says
no.
That's incorrect. So.
Wikipedia incorrect. That's very hard.
So I got this package in the mail today.
What is it?
And you are the one person I know who I would most want to see this because you are going to be ecstatic and you can explain to the audience its significance. So I'm going to hand it to you to open.
Let's see.
There's the wife. There's Beth. Careful.
Don't rip it.
Yeah.
It's fragile.
No, don't. Yeah, you can throw out the receipt. Don't look at the receipt.
It's well secured.
Good. It's old.
Is it?
All right.
And now we peel away the brown wrapping.
All right, what is that?
The Seven Arts. Michael, what is this?
I thought you'd be all ecstatic on sight.
1917.
I'm so... what a bust.
No, I'm excited. What is it?
Okay, well, let me explain to the audience. You're going to... Don't break the spine. Careful.
No.
19...
Oh, it's Randolph Bourne.
Yes.
Ah, the War and the... Oh, fabulous. The War and the Intellectuals. I didn't realize.
That's the original.
Slow. It's the original copy. Very impressive.
Okay, explain.
And it's also got something here by someone named Eugene O'Neill. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Well? He's a well-known writer.
Of course, yes.
Everyone has heard of.
So why don't you explain to the people
Sherwood Anderson
who Randolph Bourne is and why that specific essay is so important?
Well, Randolph Bourne was a pacifist who was bitterly opposed to American entry into World War I. He thought it was a major step backward for America to enter into the conflict. And one of the things that I quote in the book, 1917, one of the quotations that comes out of that essay is where he says that the key to what will happen with the entry into the war is it'll be a excuse to expand the power of the federal government and the state. That war is sort of I've forgotten the exact quote.
War is the health of the state.
War is the health of the state. There you go. And that's the quotation that I used in the book as a way of talking about what Bourne predicted turned out to be so when you have Woodrow Wilson running a wartime program for development of the state, a lot of which, of course, we still live with today.
And what's amazing about I love him, I think he's such a fascinating figure. He was deformed. Like they pulled out the forceps, so one of his ears was much lower. He was a hunchback. He was 5 feet tall. And as soon as he turned, all the leftists, all the progressives couldn't get enough of World War I. They were all gung-ho. And he was the only one who was like, what are you doing? This is what we're against. And then it became deformed body, deformed mind. That was the quote. And John Dewey the great progressive, refused to work on magazines with Bourne. And he was basically blacklisted and completely run out of town and rail for not wanting the U.S. to enter the war to end all wars, which he also said was just demented on its face. The idea we're going to have this war and then never have war again. And he died in 1918 at the age of 32 as a result of that influenza epidemic.
Yeah, that's true.
And he was the first person to advocate for the handicapped. He wrote a piece in the Atlantic about being handicapped, and his first book, Youth and Life, was regarded as basically the first capturing of the counterculture.
Now that I did not know.
Yeah.
What I do know about Bourne is that he was ostracized because of his stance against a war, which seemed to many, including Woodrow Wilson, but also many others, as a chance to sort of be a new broom to sweep clean a lot of the kind of failure to get the federal government more involved in running people's lives.
Yeah, they saw it as a dress rehearsal.
Yeah.
To have, intellectuals, this is our chance to not have wasteful freedom, and we're going to have everything efficient. And we hear this today when Bernie Sanders is like, do you really need 20 types of deodorant? Well, the alternative to 20 isn't 10, it's 0.
Yeah, my mother used to say that too. She's a long-standing socialist. Her example wasn't the deodorants; it was toothpastes.
Okay.
Do you really need to have 20 toothpastes? And going into a drugstore. And so, no, of course, you need the people's toothpaste.
Yeah, which is gold teeth.
or the people's deodorant in order to get through. You'll be fine. So I mean that dream of and you talk to socialists during World War II, particularly in Britain, and for them, part of the whole idea of the big social advance after the war, the Beveridge Plan and so on, was the kind of unity that we experienced and enforced during wartime is now one we can carry through into peacetime,
right?
Well.
And the people have shown that they'll be submissive for it.
They'll submit to it, yeah. Because it's all for the national good. The U.S. didn't have quite that experience, as I explained in the Freedom's Forge, because it was built differently. The war mobilization was done differently than it had been. And World War I was much closer to a true fascist state. In World War II, although many had hoped for a repeat of that, it comes out a little differently.
Well, what were those differences?
The differences were the private sector really was really driving the wartime production, and there was the conscious decision was made to keep the civilian sector, the economy, running as close to normal as possible. There was rationing, of course, gas rationing, for example. Some clothing rationing, that we had to use coupons in order to buy certain things. But if you look at it from a quantitative point, if you're a number cruncher type, and you look at civilian production versus wartime production, they almost about balance out, which is very interesting considering how much resources had to be poured into getting America to fight two-front war. It's extraordinary.
This is something I think we discussed last time, but it certainly bears repeating because I think it's one of the most important concepts. The argument is, without Woodrow Wilson, you don't get either Hitler or Lenin. You don't get either Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. Do you think there's veracity to that claim?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I state it not quite as baldly as that in my book, 1917, but that's pretty close to the truth. And it certainly is not what Wilson intended.
Sure.
But what he did was he created, by his entry of the United States into the war, and then recasting the war as being this war to end all wars, as you were saying before. And he created a situation in which, both in the case of Russia and also in the case of Germany, two countries that were completely disrupted by the wartime experience, a situation was created in which political extremism could triumph. First, communism, in the case of Russia, into the Soviet Union, and then in the case of Germany, of a peace settlement, which was really devised in ways to breed as much resentment on the part of the German population as possible, and to set the stage for political extremism there.
Let's break down even more specific.
Which could have been communism. We always have to keep this in mind,
Sure.
The political extremism in Germany, because we know where it ends. It finishes with 1933 and Hitler coming to power. It could very easily have been the communists coming to power there as well. People had given up on Western civilized values and were looking for any kind of way in which to regain Germany's position in the world.
And there had been communist uprisings in Germany in the past.
Right after the war, and then also in the early 1920s as well, the communists were a very, very powerful group. And when Hitler comes to power, the smart ones, when the communists realize that's the stronger horse, and we're gonna shift our attention in that direction.
Yeah, let's break down more specifically how one can lay the blame for Lenin at Wilson's footprints.
Well, the book 1917, I kind of go into this in some detail. We have to always remember that the Russian Revolution, we think of the Russian Revolution, we think about it for those of a certain age cinematically with Dr. Zhivago and so on. But the real Russian Revolution had nothing to do with Lenin or the communists. It had to do with the seizing of power by democratic forces in the capital, in St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was called during the war, and the creation of an embryonic constitutional democracy. That's the real Russian Revolution. That's the one that really overthrew the Tsar and really put Russian politics and Russian society on a new basis, a Western-oriented basis. And it was at that moment that Wilson could have played an important card, which was to get Russia to gain support for that government, and insisted this is going to be the future of Russia. And then also, and this is what I also argue in the book, to use American influence in order to bring the war closer to an end than it did, and to really insist to the Allies, look, we now have a democratic Russia. Here's our opportunity to really wind down this conflict and reach a negotiated settlement with Germany. And he was urged to do that by many in his cabinet. As a matter of fact, there was a plan sort of saying, we've got now an opportunity to bring the war to an end, which is what we've wanted to do all along. But Wilson didn't. And at that point, his belief was that the war had to be pursued to the overthrow of the existing political system in Germany, and that if Russia was unwilling to participate in that, then he was perfectly willing to support a government that would come into power that would seem to be supportive of that. And that was the case with Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So just enough uncertainty about the future of Russia as an allied power, which it was in the war, to create the opportunity for Lenin and the Bolsheviks to seize power.
Lenin is such a fascinating figure because, and just like Hitler in many ways, like before they seized...
I think the comparison's very apt.
Yeah, I mean, because they're both lunatics, right? They're both this kind of messianic, I'm going to remake the world in my image, right? And I'm going to cleanse the world in a sense of like the bad people, whoever those may be. Hitler, the Jews; Lenin, it's the capitalists or whatever. And they got a lot closer to their goal than should have ever happened. Is it when you're writing about a figure like this as a historian, like how do you kind of grapple with someone who's both on one hand crazy, on the other hand, moving the world through the force of their will?
I would add a third to that list, and that's Wilson.
Oh yeah,
I'm surprised. Don't leave him off of that
sure.
list. Hitler, Lenin, Wilson, all three of them obsessed with their own righteousness and the certitude that their ideas and their vision is correct, and that any opposition is more than just simply wrongheadedness or disagreement. It's evil.
Right.
And it has to be suppressed and has to be extirpated. That's the case with all three of them. I find it part of what I try to do as an historian is to suspend judgment as I write, and which I think separates me out from a lot of current historians.
Sure.
That used to be part of what a historian did, was to explain what happened, not necessarily to justify it or to condemn it, but explain why people act the way they do. In order to do that, you have to get into the head of your protagonists, whether it's a Lenin or a Wilson or a Gandhi, in the case of the Gandhi and Churchill, or whether it's a Plato and Aristotle with Cave in the Light, where I really try to humanize these figures who are sort of, iconic, Plato and Aristotle. Well, they're human beings also, and you have to understand how they arrive at worldview that they bring about. And that's true for Plato and Aristotle. It's true for Gandhi, and it's true for Lenin and Wilson and a Hitler as well. This isn't to let them off the hook. You're not looking to excuse. You're looking to explain. And by doing so, you come to understand, I think, a much more why things happen than they are if you simply say, this guy's really evil, or he's just a psychopath, which people have done with Hitler, for example. Hitler's a much more complex figure than that. And in many ways, it's important to realize the degree to which he was, in many ways, a conventional figure, particularly in German politics. People don't realize that.
How was he a conventional figure?
In the sense that every German politician in the 1920s was looking at ways to overthrow the Versailles settlement, Versailles Treaty. Everyone was looking for how to restore Germany to its rightful position. All of them had anti-Semitism and attacks on Jews as part of their political repertoire. This was standard practice in Germany and also in Austria by the 1920s and 1930s. And so for many voters who turned to Hitler in 1933 and elect the Nazi Party to lead the country in the Reichstag, he's seen as someone who really sort of says what everybody thinks, what everybody's already thinking, and who seems to have the kind of following that can really make this happen. The difference with Hitler is that what other people said as a matter of rhetoric, he took seriously.
Yeah.
He has this, as Alan Taylor used to say, the historian used to say, there was a terrifying literalness about him. Everybody else wanted the Jews driven out of German society. He did it.
Yeah.
Everybody else sort of said, you know what, they're a racial threat and they're a danger. And he took it seriously and acted upon it. And by the time those who may have thought that maybe this is going a little too far, we didn't think he would go this far in this development, it was too late. They were already committed. They were already involved in a state of which the degree of corruption that maintained the Nazi Germany regime. We always have to remember this too. These people, Lenin, Hitler, Wilson, as much driven by political opportunists who make it possible for them to gain and then hold power as it is anything else.
Well, because there's the idea that he's going to be the horse and I'm going to be the jockey, right, and I can control this person. And then, that was
very much the case with Hitler, of course. And I think it was also the case with Lenin in the sense that the assumption was that because we've all been through this from the beginning, all the old comrades, Kamenev and Zinoviev and Bukharin, that Lenin's vision is one that we share, and that therefore the methods that he'll create are also ones that we can embrace. And what they didn't realize is that there were two, again, with sort of terrifying literalness, there were two figures in the Soviet hierarchy in the 1920s who were prepared to act on what Lenin's vision was and really carry it out to fruition. One was Stalin, of course. The other one is Trotsky. Trotsky ends up being kind of a hero. You have people like Isaac Deutscher writing a two-volume biography that casts him as the hero. Well, he's the hero only because he's Stalin's enemy, an arch enemy. But we have to remember that if Trotsky had won the power struggle after Lenin's stroke and had taken power, it's difficult to know how things would have turned out that much differently in terms of the human suffering inflicted on the Soviet population.
And Trotsky freely discussed the use of terror.
Totally.
He openly praised it.
There's a book, Communism and Terrorism, which is about the fact that, hey, you know what, we're in a situation in which being opposed to the use of terror is itself a sign of the problem.
Yeah,
and it needs to be extirpated at the same time.
You have written so many books about such major world-changing personalities. Who is the one person you wish you'd written a book about?
Well, let's see. I would say the person who I would really look forward to writing a book at some point on would be on Bismarck. I think that Bismarck is a fascinating figure.
Oh, yeah.
I think very much understood. I think he speaks to our time more than almost any other statesman from the 19th or 20th centuries.
Oh, yeah. Public education.
Yep. Public education, but also his understanding of how the correlation of forces that maintain peace really function and the function of war. As I said in the 1917 book, Bismarck fought necessary wars and killed thousands. Woodrow Wilson and Lenin fought justified wars and killed millions, right? I think he's someone who speaks very much to our time. And I actually see a lot of parallels between Bismarck and Trump, which when I present that to my editors, they're like, get out of here. I don't want to hear about this. Don't talk
Bismarck
about this.
good, Trump bad. Bismarck's up here, Trump's down here. Yeah.
In their minds.
Yeah.
And I say, no, actually, there's great parallels between them. Because of our misunderstanding about who Bismarck was and what kind of person he was from which is policy. So he's definitely one of the people I would want to do a book on.
Hey guys, Michael Malice here, and I am delighted to tell you about Heshy Socks, HESHI Socks.com. If you use promo code WELCOME30, they're going to give you 30% off your entire order. Why do I swear by these socks? Because they don't wear out, because they're made with high-end Pima cotton. I don't know what that means, but I know that they're soft and they don't smell, and they stay up on your leg. So they've got the nice ones for the office or for restaurants. They've got the basic ones for all you basic hoes in my audience. I love them. I wear them. They're smart. They send me some to wear, and I wear them all the time. If you go to heshysocks.com, HESHI Socks.com, and use promo code WELCOME30, you get 30% off. Plus, they just dropped a new collection with some cool colors that I am currently enjoying almost as much as I'm enjoying this Arthur Herman interview. Heshysocks.com, they've been with us for a while, and I'm very, very glad that that is the case. Let's get back to it.
I just finished reading a biography of Emma Goldman, who I have a soft spot for because she's such a kind of an iconoclast in many ways. And Woodrow Wilson, your boy, deported her. It was J. Edgar Hoover who rounded her up, sent her out to Russia after not being in Eastern Europe for 30 years, something like that. And she gets there, and it's her being an anarchist, the vision was, under the revolution, we're going to have absolute free speech and every individual can flourish. And she gets there, and, all the anarchists are being rounded up, banished, murdered, tortured, their families murdered and tortured. And she sits down with Lenin, and she's like, what is this? This is not what it's about. And he's basically like, well, it's a transition period, so you need kind of totalitarianism in the short term. And for some reason, it's always a transit, until you get to literal heaven on earth.
Things are tough for now.
Right.
I mean, look at Kim Jong-un, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I mean, he's in a transitional phase.
Yeah.
Right? Hasn't that been the case?
But it's just fascinating how also people on the right, I see this on social media, they think that the left is this big monolith. And there were so many conflicts even at the time. And what I wanted to ask you as a historian, I just also finished reading a biography of Walter Duranty, who's probably one of the most evil, despicable men in history. And for those who don't know, when Stalin was inflicting his genocide by starvation on Ukraine in the early 30s, Duranty was covering it for the New York Times and was saying not only was it that everything's fine, but making a point to sarcastically sneer at people who claimed otherwise, that they don't know what they're talking about. These people this is just propaganda against the Soviet state. Do you think, one of my quotes is that the corporate press are the enemy of the people. Do you think media, as a historian, that media has gotten worse in recent times? Or do you think there always was this kind of venality to it?
I would say both. But I think that what we've seen and what we're experiencing now with regard to the media, what's called the mainstream media, is a continuation of the kind of disingenuous, we use the term lying.
Yeah.
But basically the people call it fake news. I call it manufactured news.
Right.
I think is a better way to put it. Because sometimes there is a basis of empirical reality, some of it, but it's created, and run through a narrative filter of a sort that is, and this is what's so scary about it, which is not only false in and of itself, but is systematically reproduced by all the other media organs at the same time. But they call the echo chamber.
Right.
Echo chamber, I don't think really gets to how malign that process is and how complicit the major media organizations and their CEOs are in this overall process. And I have a prediction to you, Michael, talking about this. We can talk about where I think a lot of this came from,
Please.
where it starts. But my prediction to you is that one of the reasons why we're seeing this big push now on these Ukraine hearings and the effort now for the Democrats to focus primarily on the question of the quid pro quo between Trump and the Ukrainian president over exposing corruption within the previous Ukrainian regime is a fear on the part of both Democrats and media that the more we learn about the origins of the Russia collusion hoax, the more complicit key figures in the media will be in knowingly spreading false information, manufactured news, as a means by which to undermine and destroy the Trump presidency. That what we're going to find out is that Walter Duranty, there's lots of Walter Duranty's in the media right now who appear on cable TV, on the mainstream press, who editorial boards of places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and that part of the frenzy to prevent this story from coming out and the fear of what will come out from some of the reports, the Inspector General's report, the John Durham report, springs precisely from that they will turn out to have been complicit, consciously involved in spreading false information.
That was
at the behest of their political superiors.
That was a great cover version of my favorite song, because I sing this song every day on social media. Coming from the Soviet Union and being raised a certain way, it is even
you know how this works.
Oh, but I'm also sometimes even shocked by the brazenness with which exactly what you're describing is put over it. What you're calling is, on the internet is colloquially referred to as the red pill, meaning the awareness that what we're presented as truth is in fact like you said, and this is a quote from my book, a carefully constructed narrative designed to keep some very unpleasant people in power. There's a very big difference between what you're describing, and I try to be conservative ahead of this all the time. There's a very big difference between, there's a left-wing bias to our coverage. If there was just some left-wing bias to the coverage, that's fine. Or if there was just some moderate, mild right-wing bias covered, that'll be fine too.
That could be filtered out.
Yeah, and that comes from a place of honesty. If I'm a Democrat and I genuinely perceive Barack Obama, and this isn't a hard argument to make, is to be a more ethical person than Donald Trump, and I will write my stories that way, okay. There's very different between the fact that Amy Rohrbach, this was a big red pill moment, where she's caught on tape, brazenly saying, I 100% think Jeffrey Epstein was murdered. But if the cameras were on, or publicly on, and she said that she'd be fired, and it would be her job and her colleague's job to mock the very idea that anyone would think this. So I don't know if he was murdered. I honestly would guess he probably wasn't. But to claim that even wondering how this could have happened means you're crazy, whereas behind the scenes, she's like, yeah, I totally believe it. That dissonance and that disconnect, that is the problem. That's the difference between having a bias and we are knowingly lying to you in what we are presenting as fact.
Right. And we're lying to you for a particular purpose, which is to support our power elite.
Yes.
For whom we are beholden and who we support. Whether it's the handling of the Jeffrey Epstein case, the Harvey Weinstein case.
Yes.
What we see is mainstream media basically complicit in what is happening of a truly disgusting. And when I talk about the Epstein murder, I'm talking about before.
Yeah.
Where everybody knew who he was and knew what he was doing and who he was associating and who was associating with him.
Right.
But who, in order to preserve their relationship with power, these things were kept under wraps, kept secret, and not allowed to be discussed.
And it was very telling in that interview because she didn't say, if she had said, we can't get this out there because the palace came down hard on us, like legal threats, which is possible. It's possible that they're like, look, you better have your everything down because this is huge defamation. You know what I mean? And that's true. They could have then at that point leaked the story somewhere to be like, all right, someone's preying on kids. We can't cover it legally, whatever. But she says explicitly the issue was we couldn't get an interview with Meghan Markle. It wasn't, they were going to sue us out of business. It's that they were holding an interview with Meghan Markle is what's kept us hostage. So that, I think, to many people was very, very disturbing to see. And then also, she releases this statement, which is basically like, you can just imagine her read. It was a written statement, but you can imagine her reading it like a hostage. She's like, "Oh, I said what I said in a moment of anger and frustration. I didn't mean any of it." It's like, lady, you weren't that angry.
Was she blinking Morse code at the same time? Sort of saying, what I'm saying is totally untrue.
And you're reading this, and you're like, who are you fooling?
No.
And did you see what happened? That the person, they didn't know who leaked this footage. ABC called CBS, said, "We found someone who accessed this," and talk about collusion. Yeah. CBS fired that person.
Yep,
that is unconscionable.
Yeah, and people need to realize is it's part of a pattern. These aren't isolated moments. These aren't sort of anomalies of a breakdown because so and so is doing a lousy job or dropped the ball. This is the way in which they operate, and what you're going to see, I think, is that and I have said this before, Michael. I think that what we see in the struggle between Trump, the media, and their Democrat allies. Notice how I put that, right?
Yes.
The media and their allies.
Yes, correct.
It's a fight to the finish.
Yes.
And I don't think this is going to end very well for them. I think my prediction is Trump will actually win this and will win this struggle, but it's one which is going to bring down the temple in ways that we have not really seen, that it make even the Watergate appear.
Do the split screen with the book cover. See? That's him as Samson on my book cover, bringing down the temple.
Bringing down the temple. That's interesting.
Yeah. You have written so many books about such major world-changing personalities. Who is the one person you wish you'd written a book about?
Well, let's see. I would say if there's one person who I would love to do a biography of and really have not had the opportunity to do it, it would probably be William Jennings Bryan.
Oh, the great communicator.
The great communicator.
The original.
And what a career. When I was a kid, I read Matt Koenig's biography, Louis Koenig's biography of Bryan, and I was absolutely captivated by it. I'm a political button collector and political memorabilia, and I have a Bryan collection to which I add, for every year, new items with it. 3 times nominated for president, 3 times defeated. The Scopes trial, his later career, when he was hawking real estate in Florida.
Oh, did
you know about this?
I did not.
Yeah, absolutely. After the Scopes trial, he became spokesman for real estate developers in Florida, and investors flocked, to the message that the great communicator spread, talking about the opportunities here in Florida. And then, of course, came the devastating hurricane of 1926. The real estate market collapsed. Bryan's investors lost everything. He lost everything. Totally ignominious finish for one of the most amazing politicians in American history.
And what's fascinating when you see people who don't know their history.
And we also remember, too, when he was Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson entered the war, Bryan exited.
On principle.
He said, on principle.
But it's also fascinating, contemporary times, people think, and therefore think has always been the case, that religion and politics is a function of the right wing. Whereas I would think Bryan is probably the first one to have a very much religious approach to politics. And also the idea that we want inflation because that's a good way for poor people to pay off their debts. Like, this is something that is kind of crazy to us nowadays, but that's, what they were arguing then.
And also, too, Bryan is, it's important to realize he's before the progressives. So he tends to be seen by historians through a progressive lens, but he's not. He defies all the categories of politics that will come later on with the progressive era. And that has also, I think, led to a real distortion of his view and of his importance in American history and American politics.
Hey, party people. Let me tell you guys about Blinkist. This is a great app. What Blinkist does, let me give you the promo code. If you go to Blinkist.com, Blinkist.com/malice, free 7-day trial, 25% off on your subscription. What they do is, it's an app, you get unlimited access to a massive library of condensed non-fiction books. So all that crap, all the NPCs are talking about in The Office or on Tinder or anywhere else there are parties, you download the app, 15 minutes, you get the idea of the entire book. Some girls likes Michelle Obama. Oh yeah, I read Becoming. No, I just spent 15 minutes listening to it. Tim Ferriss, Dale Carnegie, they've got the old school stuff. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Here's one habit. Don't read an entire book when you could just spend 15 minutes and get the gist. If you go to Blinkist.com/Malice, free 7-day trial. Is anything better for free? Yes, but it's still pretty darn good. Let's get back to the show.
I have this quote. I always say the battle is won when the average American views a corporate journalist exactly as they view a tobacco executive. Now, I think they're actually much worse than tobacco executives, but let's just get the average citizen that far, because let's talk about this, because you've written about a lot of very...
well, don't forget, I have talked, where these issues were very much in my mind was when I was writing the Joe McCarthy book.
Right.
Because there is a classic example. In fact, that's one of the turning points. If I had to point to the 2 turning points in which the media really became corrupt in terms of its political outlook, but also its own self-image. One was the Joe McCarthy episode, in which we had people like Edward R. Murrow and CBS claiming credit for having exposed this reckless demagogue. And of course, they were actually latecomers to the game.
Sure.
That's another issue but we can talk about in more detail. But the other one, of course, was Watergate, where suddenly the press felt like we can bring down presidents when we wish. And when you start thinking about that power, of having that kind of power, and you think that, well, you know what, at times maybe we'll run stories that aren't necessarily entirely true, that are based on unnamed sources, but help to get us to the goal to which we're headed, which Wood and Bernstein did all the time. If you look at the kinds of stories that the Washington Post was putting out from 1972 to 1974, a lot of them were driven by pure innuendo with sources. Everyone says deep throat. There were lots of stories that had no real sources, but were simply there to keep the blood in the water in the hopes that at some point the sharks would bite and bring Nixon down. And that's a technique that they learned. It goes back to the McCarthy episode, but it's a technique that they learned and then really made their own during the Watergate years. And we've had to live with it every time there's been a Republican president. Reagan, H. Bush, W. Bush. It's all been the same pattern.
Let's talk a bit about McCarthy, because I tweeted this out. If McCarthy had been trying to root out Klansmen instead of communists for the government, he'd be regarded as an American saint, and every one of his excesses and even lies would be dismissed out of hand because, well, he's just overzealous in pursuit of the good.
Overzealous, that's the term for it.
But because he's looking for communists, which is, let's be clear what we're talking about. This is an enemy foreign government intent on fomenting violent revolution in this country, and as a consequence of which would have short-term loss of life and almost certainly genocide in the medium term.
Right.
And these are people who swore allegiances to a foreign government to do whatever possible to make this happen. However, we are told to this day that they just wanted to vote like Jill Stein for president.
That's right.
And this is a huge overreaction. And what's the big deal?
It's called the Red Scare.
The Red Scare, yeah.
It's the McCarthy was on a witch hunt, and he was on a power trip. And this was all driven by him and his closet homosexual aide, Roy Cohn, et cetera, et cetera. That's very much the way in which the narrative has been beat. Now, when you read my book, what you'll find out, which is really the first balanced account of McCarthy's career and of the times and the political culture that he was operating in, what you'll discover is, of course, there was a lot of flaws to McCarthy, very serious ones. But what McCarthy did that made him so dangerous was not just that he was out chasing after communists, because that was very much the hunt. 1948 to 1950, Richard Nixon had exposed Alger Hiss as being, in effect, a communist agent. And
a spy.
A spy. And people realized, and people suddenly realized this is a really serious problem.
And Alger Hiss was high up.
He was high up.
He's not some rando.
If Henry Wallace had been elected president in 1948 on the progressive ticket, Alger Hiss would have been his Secretary of State.
Okay.
No doubt about it. And if Nixon hadn't exposed him and Whittaker Chambers, he very likely would have been Undersecretary of State in the Truman administration in 1948. But the scandal broke, and it became one that really shook Washington's foundations.
And Nixon was never forgiven for this.
It was absolutely not. He would be haunted by it, and it would be one of the major strikes against him for the rest of his career.
Yeah, let's break that down for the listeners, right?
Sure.
So Nixon exposes that there is a major figure high up in Washington who is feeding information directly to Stalin. And as a consequence of this, Nixon's the bad guy.
Right.
To this day, because you're paranoid. It's like, but we found the witch. We have proof.
Yeah, we have proof, and we have it retrospectively through the Venona decrypts, which it becomes possible. But we also have eyewitness, which was Whittaker Chambers. He said, "Yeah, I worked with him together," and the circumstantial evidence supported Chambers. It did not support Hiss, but Hiss was an establishment figure. He had gone to the right schools. He had clerked for Oliver Wendell Holmes on the Supreme Court. He had people like Dean Acheson and the Carnegie Foundation, which he had worked, vouching for his integrity and veracity. But what McCarthy had done was, and where he really sort of stepped on the third rail with this, was he sort of said, okay, we've got communists in the government. I've got a list, FBI and other law enforcement agencies have clearly identified that we have communists been working in the federal government and connected with Soviet espionage. But the real problem, he said, was we've got a political party who are hiring these people.
Yeah.
And who, when they're exposed as communists, don't seem to be very much concerned about it and seem to actually be willing to be enablers for the role of communists within our government, both in terms of domestic policy but also foreign relations. And that was the really explosive message that McCarthy came through, and that's where the Democrats turned on him. What's interesting, as I explain in my book, is that actually was the making of his career because people believed it. They had seen the leftward turn, the sharp leftward turn that had happened with the New Deal, with the Roosevelt Brain Trust and the others that were involved.
Right.
So the idea of the New Deal and New Deal Democrats being allied with communists actually made a lot of sense. What brought him down, as I explain in the book, is when after 1952, and Dwight Eisenhower, as much as anyone, should have thanked him for that 1952 election and getting a Republican into the White House for the first time since Herbert Hoover.
20 years, yeah.
20 years. The problem is that then McCarthy, when the Eisenhower administration began to frustrate his efforts to look for more communists and to open this up wider, decided that the communists had infiltrated the Republican Party as well. And that's when the American electorate turned against him. They could buy the idea of the Democratic Party being a harbinger and enablers of communism. The Republican Party didn't make sense, and his credibility began to sink after that.
It's fascinating to me how he is the Red Scare, McCarthyism, is regarded historically as probably the worst thing to happen in this country since slavery, right? And then you turn on the TV, and literally every day it's Russia, 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 Russia. And I tweeted this out. I'm like, it's fascinating. Like, why would Putin want Trump to ally himself with his archenemy, Ukraine? There is such a provincial mindset to this kind of thinking where it's like, it's us and everyone over there is the same. And it's like the hatred between Ukraine and Russia cannot be overstated.
So visceral.
It's just off the charts. And understandably so. In fact, I was born in Ukraine, but I speak Russian. But if you speak to Ukrainian in Russian, it's like slapping them. They get extremely offended. And no one seems to bat an eye that Trump, on its face, is colluding with Ukraine.
Yeah, and it's a completely incoherent. As you said, it's a fake narrative. It's a manufactured narrative, but it's also an incoherent one. And the idea is that you can use the news cycle, which constantly, it's like a Heraclitean universe, right? Ideas pop up, then they swept away. The next day, it's another revelation. It's another whistleblower. It's another aspect of this, which really has no substance behind it. But, everybody gets to talk about it and do the headlines on CNN about this. And it's the idea that simply dominating the news cycle, even with nonsense, that eventually you'll wear Republicans out. And that's really a battle comes down to. I live in Washington, I work in Washington, so I get to see this, what's unfolding here, this drama firsthand. And what you come to realize is that all of this media attention, all of the effort here is all focused inside the Beltway.
Yes.
It is to find a way to convince Republicans in the Senate that it's just not worth it sticking with Donald Trump, and that even if these charges are fake, or even if they don't rise to the level of impeachment, it's an abuse of power, sure, but not one that you kick a president out for. Even if you concede that regardless of the merits of the case, we just can't go on like this. We can't stand this. And what I've also seen, Michael, firsthand sitting in Washington, is the effect it has on people who try to work for the Trump administration. And I know people personally for whom simply trying to do your job, having to work on one of the agencies that's part of the executive branch right now, you become the target for abuse. You become a target for being called and having subpoenas dropped on your doorstep. The goal here, and this is one of the more insidious aspects of it. The goal is to make working for Donald Trump a source of social and professional death.
He is far more.
And that's the other level of pressure to be brought to bear.
He is an existential threat to the status quo. Yeah. And trust is not symmetric. If you sit here and tell me 100 truths and 10 lies, I'm going to look at you as a liar. Even though it's 10 to 1. So when you exposed, as you were just saying earlier, this isn't some bias, this is systemic and long-term and not salvageable, you can't go, there's this belief that, and I talk about this in my book, if Trump vanishes, this is all going to go back to normal. And I think that is absolutely an absurdity.
Couldn't agree more.
I don't think you have to have any perspective on anything to look at Jeffrey Epstein and how the press covers him, both during his career and his death, and now to be like, something's rotten in the state of Denmark, as you mentioned earlier, and this is a very disturbing. Covington, you don't have to have any perspective on Trump or anything to be like, this is obscene. And here's my big one, as again, an anarchist, is during the campaign, we were told every single day that Trump has such a loose temper, he's going to get us into a nuclear war with any country that offends him on Twitter. And do you trust him with this finger on the button, blah, 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 right? This was a constant refrain. The second debate, that was the first question to Carly Fiorina. And now, where he is fighting tooth and nail to escalate America's war presence overseas, now he's dangerous for not getting us into war.
For de-escalating.
Yes. And
being afraid to use American force.
And it's the same people, and there's not even any. It would make sense to me if they were like, you know what? I was worried that, he'd get us into nuclear war. Now I'm worried, but it's never phrased like that. There's never an acknowledgement that I'm shifting my perspective. It's always this very, very kind of brave new world, 48-hour window, and we pretend the past never happened.
Yep. And you look at a book like Nikki Haley's new book out, right, where she talks about the effort to undermine the Trump presidency from the beginning, from key figures in the administration. And what you come to realize is that this has been going on now since January of 2017.
Oh, earlier.
The effort to make it earlier in terms of that, but in terms of of undermining the ability of a sitting president to perform his duty. This has been ongoing, and what you come to realize is that when Donald Trump sits in the Oval Office, he really doesn't know who to trust.
Right.
This is a serious problem. You talk about trust. He doesn't know, even among his own staff, even among those who come in from other branches of the other parts of the executive branch for meetings, what kind of story they're going to tell when they leave the room. If you ever noticed, this is why he has family members with him all the time. Ivanka is there in meetings with him, or Jared, or Donald Jr., because he needs somebody he can trust who can be an eyewitness to what's taking place and be able to sort of refute when someone goes out and sort of said, he was out of his mind, he was raging, or he was behaving like a 5-year-old. It's a very, very dangerous situation, and it's amazing that he's managed to last as long as he has.
Yeah, but I think it's also because so many people use social media and are, for example, PolitiFact, which is I think a function of the Washington Post, if I'm not mistaken. They just had a tweet yesterday that I think it was Governor Rick Scott or someone from Florida had said that the Democratic candidates, presidential candidates, were saying that they would give free health care for illegal immigrants. We rated that as mostly false. And someone retweeted, they go, but there's literally video. And the attached video of the debate goes, show of hands. And if that's their position, that's fine, but don't pretend that's not, and they all raise their hands. And you watch this, and you're like, you don't even know how to begin to wrap your head around it.
No. And social media has really accelerated the corruption, but it's also worked to expose it, I think. You think
it's accelerated the corruption?
I think it has, because it's really now so much of what happens in the news cycle is driven in order to encourage social media to pick up and go with it.
Okay.
It both feeds off of the social media, but I think it also looks for ways in which social media can take on the message and spread it out.
Now
so if you're an ace reporter now for Washington Post or Los Angeles Times, one of the ways in which you measure your effectiveness is how many Twitter followers you have, right? How many followers you have on Facebook, and so this becomes a key to what it is for journalistic success. Not telling the truth, not exposing falsehood or misrepresentations, as used to be or was supposed to be part of what the journalistic profession was all about.
You have written so many books about such major world-changing personalities. Who is the one person you wish you'd written a book about?
Let's see. I would say if there's one person who I would love to do an extended biography, really, and maybe even do a film on, it would probably be Felix the Cat. Felix had an enormous influence on me as a child. I followed his adventures with great absorption. And to this day, that song from the 1950s television show still haunts me in the long watches of the night, and often find myself singing it when I wake up in the morning. And of course, he's also part of the history, of comic strip, but also of animated film in America as well. There wouldn't really be a Mickey Mouse if it hadn't been for Felix the Cat. In my mind, Mickey Mouse is the spin-off from the original American hero, and that's Felix the Cat.
Have you come across anything in your research to lend veracity to the idea that he didn't die of natural causes and this was some kind of, lack of a better term, inside job?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about that. And certainly I have great doubts about the medical examiner who did, in fact, carry out the autopsy. I think there's a lot of questions which still have not been answered, which we really need to address and really needs to be brought into focus. I won't say where my inside sources are about what the mysterious death of Felix the Cat. Was it really self-inflicted? Was it perhaps the result of a cult murder? There have been those rumors as well. Those are the kinds of things that if I were to write the definitive biography, those are the things that I would very much want to explore and hopefully get to the bottom of it.
Now, are you familiar with the term the black pill? Because you've cured it.
Now, the red pill, I did not know about the red pill. I don't know about the black pill, but I'm happy to know that I cured something which I didn't even know was a malady.
So you cured the black pill.
Okay.
So there's several pills on the internet, one of which sponsors the show, Blue Chew. And one of the things people often ask me is how I stay relentlessly optimistic. And I am of the very sincere belief that everything is getting better all the time. I am of the belief that, let's talk specifically about corporate media, that it's not that these people have gotten particularly worse, it's that their mask is dropping. Yeah. And now it's like if someone's a murderer and you don't know, right, and they're always in suits, and then you go to their house and there's blood everywhere. In one sense, it's worse because you're seeing blood now, but in actuality, that blood's always been there. Now you're just privy to it, so it's not like they're behaving in particularly worse. And I think things are just in every way getting profoundly better.
Well, I think this is the case with the social media and the mainstream media, that what they thought would be their tool and has become their master will actually be their downfall. This, I think, is this. I'm pretty certain this is where we're going with this, and I think you're going to agree with me. It has exposed the egregiousness of the situation in ways that they did not expect, and they still don't quite understand.
And the shock of the first of all, I think you and I agree, and I think most people agree, a large part of the Trump victory was giving a finger to the establishment.
And it will be in 2020.
Yeah, it's just like, listen, I know the guy's a jackass. I know he's done horrible things. This is not someone I want my kid around necessarily, so on and so forth. But we were told daily that there is a consensus among all right-thinking people that this cannot happen. And a lot of people are like, oh, there's a consensus? Well, how about this consensus? Click. Okay, yep. Sit on it. And I think people resent being given orders as to what to do. But your first book, which was recommended very heavily by Gavin McInnes, The Idea of Decline in Western History. Again, it's one of my top, when people ask me what books people should read, I think it's one of my 10 must-read books, which I give. And it's kind of funny.
I appreciate that.
Because, well, it's true. You've earned it. And it's kind of funny because you've gone from must read to merely excellent. So it's kind of a decline. But wait, no. Your Churchill.
Be careful.
Your Churchill and Gandhi was a Pulitzer winner.
It was not a Pulitzer. It was one of the 3 finalists for Pulitzer.
Oh, how embarrassing for you. Well, we'll take this out in post. Right, Nate? Okay. So, Idea of Decline. Are you as optimistic as me still?
Yeah, I think I am. And I think that what's happening with regard to the Trump presidency is kind of proof of that.
Yeah.
That ultimately truth is out, but not necessarily in ways that people are going to enjoy or like. But this is one of the facets of how societies work and how they renew themselves. And what I see in the case of Trump, I have maybe a little bit higher view of him, opinion of him
as a person.
You do as a person?
Really?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of it is made up of what the presentation about what he's like and who he is.
I'll tell you some more off air.
Okay, but in any case, in the role that he is in, the job that he's doing right now, what I see is someone who is not so much driving a change and a major change in how American politics works, and including the media, but someone who is riding a storm, which has now swept in. The first wave of it we really felt was with the Tea Party.
Yes.
And I think the Tea Party, people call it a populist revolt, but it's not just a populist revolt. There's a lot of very fed up people here. And what Trump has done is to galvanize and really make focus that resentment of what has happened to our media, about the way in which our democracy works, where the direction our society is going in a very broad way, that I think is not going to be stopped simply by getting rid of Trump. And I'll tell you this, the other optimism I have, I think a lot of Republicans now understand this in a way which they might not have in 2017. I think the Democrats had moved faster this way or had control of the House in the 2016 election. Things maybe have turned out rather different. I think there could have been a stampede among Senate Republicans. There already was among House Republicans who all retired, sort of saying, "I can't be around here. It's going to be a catastrophe if Trump wins this election." And so, get me out of here in 2018. Right? There was like 40 of them who retired. I don't think that was entirely coincidental. They all decided to go and write their memoirs and go and play golf. They thought this was going to be a cataclysm for the Trump presidency, the first term, and there wouldn't be a first term. He'd be gone. But instead, what has happened is that simply by being able to endure and even perform the functions of a normal president, what he's really shown is the powerlessness of the media and also of his Democrat opponents, who've been intellectually bankrupt for a very long time, but now have really exposed themselves as being morally bankrupt at the same time in a very, very vivid way. So all of that means that the Republicans now, I think, understand the stakes that are involved, that getting rid of Trump, they're just going to be the next targets.
Yeah.
The next round.
You'll be the last one up against the wall.
You'll be the last one up against the wall. And I think there's a much broader understanding about that than there would have been if this had all arisen 2 years ago.
No, you know where that understanding came from? I'm sure you're going to agree with me, because they saw what happened to Brett Kavanaugh. And you can say whatever you want about Trump as a person. Brett Kavanaugh is hardly some kind of New York City real estate Lothario.
Well, I know people whose political consciousness was really raised.
Yes.
And really understood what was happening through the Brett Kavanaugh case, and who were, I think, really sort of activated as a result of that. And that's the case with my wife, for example. I think the Brett Kavanaugh case really brought her to a realization of what was really at stake here in terms of this ideological struggle between the Democrats and the Trump administration.
But it's also how little they value their, like, if you get in the way, what will be done to you?
That's right.
Shamelessly.
And now it's now not just to Supreme Court nominees, it goes down to like deputy assistant secretary level. It goes to staffers on the National Security Council. These are the people who they will not hesitate to run over if you're not willing to participate in getting rid of Trump.
Let's talk about the black pill, though. So the black pill is this idea that doom. Trump sure might be an aberration, but he hasn't built the wall. America's being overrun by the third world. They're going to vote themselves into this perpetual progressive democratic government. Drag queen story hour. The West is finished. And this is something that is not new to you. And what do you say to those people?
Well, I think that we've been through this process of suggesting that the West is done and that we're on the brink of left-wing dictatorship. I think in some ways there's some truth to that. You have to take action in order to prevent these things from happening. But as I said in that book, and as I've said elsewhere, one of the key aspects of Western civilization is its capacity for self-renewal.
Right.
And self-renewal and returning to first principles and rebuilding from what seemed to be the darkest hour becoming the finest hour. This is something which experienced over and over again in the history of the West. And it's one of the things that makes the West unique. And in The Cave in the Light, I tried to explain where that self-renewing process comes through. And it's the dynamic balance between the legacy of Plato and the legacy of Aristotle, the idealist and the realist, right? The visionary and the empiricist, the pragmatic one versus the one who takes a stand no matter what and says this is right, and if I die in order to uphold the right, then I'm willing to do that. The Socratic formula for immortality. That's the power that exists in the West. It's the power that exists in the United States too. And I think what we're seeing is that process unfolding itself right now.
Yeah, it makes me. The other thing that they always say is that how can you think things are going well when things are obviously blah 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 blah, and they go through this list. It's like social change and culture and politics. It's never obvious. You have so much information, and you have to sit there and deduce it, and it can't ever be reduced, in my view, to just one factor. And that's the issue with the people like Hitler or Lenin. It's like you can reduce this to one factor, you get rid of that factor, and everything resolves itself. That is
not true.
It's almost absurd to even posit it that way.
Yeah, and this is not to discount the importance of striking personalities or of people with powerful will in being able to shape. A lot of my books are about people who do that. Gandhi, it's about, and Churchill, and McCarthy for that matter, or Franklin Roosevelt during the arsenal of democracy when they had a choice. If we're going to rearm America and get us ready for a modern war, what's the best path to go? Government takes the lead, or do we turn to the private sector, the people who actually know how to make stuff, like Bill Knudsen, CEO of General Motors, and his colleagues.
Right.
And we turn them loose and say, this is what we need to do. Show us how to do it. Roosevelt had the insight to go against his better instincts, which were his impulse, which was to go the government route and to go the private sector route. Someone else could have made another decision, and World War II could have well turned out a different way. But at the same time, you have to realize that what thrusts these people in, gives them their power and their influence and leverage over events, is the course of events and what's happening and their ability to seize on and tune peril into opportunity. If you can do that, you'll become a great person.
And the West has accomplished so much and has been the source of so much goodness throughout the world that, to me, the idea that, it can be lost in one generation, sure, it's theoretically possible, but, we have a long ways to go before we're at that point. And again, to me, and as you talk about in your, again, must-read book, it's the exact same verbiage as Greta Thunberg telling me, how dare you, I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. We only have 10 years left. We're never, I don't think the West has ever been, even at the depths of World War II or Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think we've ever been 10 years away from destruction.
No, and I lived through, and I grew up when nuclear apocalypse was the great threat. And young people who sort of said, I live for, constantly under the threat of nuclear destruction. I got news for you. We still actually do.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, from a technological point of view, it's still possible to do it, and to envelop the planet, in nuclear winter for a generation. It is possible. What's changed it is the dynamic and the correlation of forces that made that seem like a serious threat 30 years ago or 40 years ago, and that now seems rather more theoretical, if a threat at all. The big challenge, I think, is that is to maintain the belief that the possibilities for Western civilization renewing itself and American civilization for renewing are always there.
Yes.
All that's needed is the leadership, the people, and I use the term leadership, it's kind of a cliche.
Sure.
It's not like I'm teaching at the business school, right? But the leadership is a key for all of this, and those who can crystallize those ideas and bring them forward in ways that make them effective, not just vision for the sake of vision, but vision that actually applies to a given situation so it becomes levers of power, not just simply pipe dreams. If that is possible, then you're going to then I think we're going to see the change coming. And I think even without that leadership, setting Trump aside for a minute, we're already seeing the change taking place. I think it's unfolding in front of us with the downfall of the mainstream media.
Yes. Yeah.
I think this is a major event in American history, and I would say in thinking about it as someone who writes about the history of philosophy as well, it's a major event in the history of truth. That there's this transformation of getting to understand what manufactured news and who's invested in it and who's complicit and what the consequences are.
Yeah, it's right, exactly. So we are running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
Let's see. I enjoyed opening the package. This is it was quite a surprise, and running across that. I really enjoyed talking about the media. I don't get much of a chance to do that in the work that I do at Hudson Institute. I'm focused on technology and national security. It's not something that I do a lot of work on in terms of a history, but this is a great sounding board to talk about what's relevant today in that particular sphere, and so. It's hard to think of anything in this interview that wasn't fun.
You are welcome.